Sky News at 10. Coming up, the press preview, including Checkpoint Britain, as seen here on the front of the Express. Well, tonight we're joined by the Observer's chief leader writer Sonia Sodha and the Spectator's economics correspondent Kate Andrews. That's coming up. In the next half an hour, we're going to be seeing what's making those headlines with the Observer's chief leader writer Sonia Sodha and the Spectator's economics correspondent Kate Andrews. Let's just show you what's on those front pages to begin with. The Eye lead they arrive, and the million, more than 4 times the previous record. Well, you're watching our press preview. It's a first look at what's on the front pages as they arrive. In the next half an hour, we're going to be seeing what's making those headlines with the Observer's chief leader writer, Sonia Sodha, and the Spectator's economics correspondent, Kate Andrews. Let's just show you what's on those front pages to begin with. The Eye leads with the Chancellor's announcement of a £9 billion aid package for self-employed workers affected by the pandemic, illustrated with a picture of him from that virtual news conference. The FT says 3.8 million people will benefit, but it's likely there'll be a quid pro quo, that national insurance contributions will have to rise following the end of the crisis, as and when that happens. The Telegraph points out that the criticism that the scheme won't become available until early June, a reflection, says the Chancellor, of the complexity of administering it. The Sun says the latest figures suggest Britons are dying from COVID-19 every 13 minutes. We'll ponder on that headline in just a moment with our paper reviewers, as we will The Guardian, which is reporting that nurses from outside London are being drafted in, especially to care for the influx of patients in the capital, which of course is such a hot spot. The Mail, meanwhile, suggests that the outbreak has effectively frozen the country's housing market, which had recently shown signs of a post-Brexit bounce. Indeed, The Times says ministers have advised that people simply ought to consider not moving at all. The Metro, it's reporting on random police checks to establish whether or not motorists have good reason to be out and about. Their headline, Checkpoint Britain. This is the Express, same headline for the Express, which reports that some police forces are using drones to carry out the checks. It's a blunter message in the Star. As you'll see, there it is, Checkpoint Charlies. It describes people who are heading out as morons. The Mirror leads with the moment the nation came together tonight to give a round of applause to NHS workers and carers. We're joined tonight through the miracle of modern technology by Sonia Sodha and Kate Andrews. Welcome to you again. And we're going to start, aren't we, with The Sun. We've already just shown the viewers that page 1. But, Kate, it's a very stark message. One Brit dies every 13 minutes.
So what The Sun has done here is they've taken some pretty terrible news from today, that it's the first time that the death toll reached over 100 people in a 24-hour period. I think it was precisely 119, which takes the death toll in the UK from coronavirus up to nearly 600, with 1,000 more cases confirmed, but even thousands and thousands more cases showed that people are testing negative. And this is, of course, exactly why we have gone into this quasi-lockdown, not nearly as intense as what we've seen in countries like Italy or France yet, but where people are very actively encouraged to stay home, to take that burden off of the NHS and to hopefully save lives. And you know, it's tough, and people have their jobs at risk, people have their incomes at risk. This is a genuine crisis, and we've seen the response to that from the Chancellor and the Treasury, and really unprecedented stimulus packages and pay packages for workers and business loans, which we'll come on to. But it's these figures exactly on the front page of The Sun, which is why we all are staying home, because it isn't simply about our health and our family's health around us. It's about those that we might not even know but could pass on the street or accidentally touch and infect as well.
Sonia, as a journalist, the power of numbers to keep moving people is limited, isn't it? I mean, I don't want to invoke that quote from Stalin about a million deaths being a statistic and one death being a tragedy, but there's an element of the fact that human stories move people sometimes more than bald statistics.
Of course they do, and I think it's really important to have the numbers, because it's the numbers that tell us where we are, what we might expect to happen in the coming weeks. And although things are pretty bad now, I think everyone in the NHS and in government believes this is going to get worse before it gets better. But I think what's starting to shift as well with the numbers of people, particularly in London, who are believed to have caught COVID-19, all of us really, well, lots of us will know somebody who's been suffering symptoms. I think tragically, it's going to grow increasingly likely that lots of us are going to know people who may die from COVID-19. And I think it's these, you're right, it's the stories that will really kind of hit home with people. And I think there's, as well as the numbers around the death toll, there's another set of numbers that we should look at, which is we've seen some really great explainers about this go out on social media, which is the sort of exponential growth in the number of infections, because the number of people that you might infect if you've got the virus is so much higher than the seasonal flu. And that's why staying home is so powerful, because if you think that, you know, we might infect on average 3 people if we've got the virus ourselves and we're coming into contact with people, and then that person goes on and those 3 people go on and infect another 3 people, and so on and so on. One person can be responsible over 10 contacts for infecting 80,000 people. So the numbers are absolutely huge, which is why, to put it in a positive light, if you stay home, you can make a massive difference to the transmission of the virus. Because we all only just got asked to stay home at the weekend, it is going to get worse over the next 2 to 3 weeks. But then what experts hope is that as the sort of lockdown starts to have an impact and starts to be seen in the numbers, we will hopefully start to see numbers getting infected and the tragic deaths caused by this virus to level off.
Yeah. Kate, the Guardian's suggesting that perhaps nurses from the regions might be dispatched to London, given it's such a hotspot. And also an interesting line about this new Nightingale hospital.
So the government wanted to push the peak of the virus into spring or even summer as much as they possibly could. But it does look like the peak is coming sooner and swifter than they had hoped. And it's thought that from early April, which is now next week, it's going to become much more of a burden on the NHS. They have built this makeshift hospital, this Nightingale hospital, and they're talking now, The Guardian has an exclusive, about bringing nurses from all over the country down to this hospital. They're going to be working in shifts that, you know, it's hard to imagine. They're going to be asked to sleep there. They're going to be asked to be working around the clock. But from our testing so far, we know that the outbreak has been most severe in London. That could change at any given time. It looks like we'll be ramping up testing in the UK in the near future, hopefully. So we'll get a broader, bigger, and more put together picture of what's happening around the country. But we know in London right now that this virus is going to be a really big burden on the NHS. So they're talking about bringing in workers from all over the country into this hub to help treat as many patients as they can. And there's even talk about using, potentially, if it's possible, if it's medically possible, one ventilator for multiple patients. They're just trying to increase capacity as much as they possibly can, because when COVID-19 first came to the UK, it was very clear we didn't have near any number of resources that we were going to need to tackle it. So they're just trying to increase bodies, people, ventilators, all of it as much as they can in the areas that they need it.
Sonia, take us to the front of the eye. Self-employed given support worth £9 billion.
Yeah, I just wanted to say a bit more about that Guardian story, actually. So there's an incredible figure in there, which is that the critical care bed capacity in London will have increased 27-fold by the time this new hospital is up and running, which I think is absolutely incredible and testament to the doctors and clinicians who've been involved in getting this hospital up and running. But ventilator capacity is really limited, as Kate's just said, and I think there are serious questions to ask of the government here. They should have been procuring ventilators some 8 weeks ago when we knew this was coming. And actually, we've had ventilator manufacturers here in the UK say that they've made offers to government to ramp up production, but they've not heard back. So I think there are very serious, I think it's a huge, huge acknowledgement is due to the people who've been involved in setting up this new hospital, but very serious questions to be asked to the government around its competency around procurement, because without the right number of ventilators, those critical care beds are not going to make as much difference.
We know that James Dyson is amongst those who have got the contract to produce more, thousands, they hope, of more ventilators. I tell you what, let's just move on, shall we, to the Times, the housing market. I mean, this on one level sort of feels obvious, doesn't it, that the virus is going to effectively suspend the housing market. The normal transactions that involve people, surveyors, etc., just become impossible. Kate?
Well, in many ways, the guidance that's already been issued would naturally suspend the housing market because people can't go around to visit homes. It's difficult to survey by social distancing as we should. And of course, these mortgage holidays that are now being offered mean that banks just don't have a lot of capacity right now to offer new loans. Apparently, they are inundated with requests for mortgage holidays, so the capacity just isn't there. And it would make sense on multiple levels. I mean, if you don't need to move home right now, if that isn't something that has to happen overnight, it would be very difficult to move home, move boxes, move into in many situations, especially in a big city like London, a cramped space, while properly socially distancing, keeping those 6 feet apart. So it makes a lot of sense that this would naturally be suspended, but the Times is saying that there's calls for government to be more clear about that guidance. And, we're seeing across the board lots of calls for government to be more clear in this area or the other. I have to say, though, in terms of the guidance that they have brought in, and especially those stimulus packages, I mean, it was on the front page of the Eye, and it's all over the papers, this bailout for the self-employed today. They are moving so quickly on policy that you would not expect to see for years, often coming from a government that we're planning on making such radical changes. So it's very important to hold government to account. It's important to ask the right questions, but also recognize that, in a matter of hours, things can change so quickly, and they're getting that guidance out there, I think, as fast as they possibly can.
Sonia, it's one thing not to be able to move house. We're hearing stories, aren't we, that some renters are struggling to keep a roof over their heads as well.
Yes, that's right. And I think it's, very anxious times, particularly if you don't know whether you're going to be able to cover your rent because you're not sure when your next sort of paycheck is coming. I think that's particularly true for low-income freelancers, gig economy workers, the low-income self-employed. The Chancellor did announce this big rescue package for people who are self-employed, as Kate's just mentioned. But one of the issues with the scheme is that the payments aren't going to be available till January, and the only support that's available to you until then is universal credit, where there are big delays of waiting for payments. There are huge queues on the website to even register. So I think people are pushing for a bit more from the Chancellor. Can he deliver some support to the self-employed, even if it's not the full amount before June, to help with things like rent checks, for example?
OK. Kate, well, we'll have to hold that thought for a second, because coming up, amid the pandemic, the nation applauds its NHS workers and carers. We'll do the same after the break. Hi there, you're watching our press preview. A first look at what's on the front pages pretty much as they arrive. In the next 10 or so minutes, we'll be looking at what's making the headlines with the Observer's chief leader writer, Sonia Sodha, and the Spectator's economics correspondent, Kate Andrews. Welcome to both of you. We're going to dive straight in with the Eye. Sonia, self-employed, given support worth £9 billion. It won't kick in early enough for some.
No, and I think, the devil is in the detail here. The Chancellor, Rishi Sunak, has been under real pressure to announce support for the self-employed along the similar lines of the support scheme, the huge support scheme that he announced last week for employees. It's quite a generous scheme. So for anyone who is self-employed and earns £50,000 a year in taxable profits or less, they will be eligible for 80% of their average earnings over the last 3 years, up to a limit of £2,500 a month. That's the same as for employees. But the real issue is that this scheme's a bit more complicated, and people won't be able to get that cash until June. And that is going to land, I think, a lot of freelancers, a lot of self-employed people, some of whom are not on very high incomes at all, in real difficulties when it comes to, for example, paying their rent and bills and all their essential outgoings. So it's tricky, and I think there are real questions to be asked. I think we have to acknowledge it is a bit more complicated than the scheme for employees, but at the same time, people are asking questions. I think they're right to. Is there any way of getting some support more immediately to self-employed people, even if it isn't the full amount? Because at the moment, the Chancellor's saying that in terms of immediate support, it's only universal credit, which can take a long time to apply for.
Kate, as Sonia says there, and actually as Rishi Sunak made pretty clear, there are the complexities to this that didn't necessarily apply to those people who are PAYE PAYE. He also introduced this idea of a sort of quid pro quo. The state will help you out this time, the self-employed, but the moral hazard that you may have to face is that we increase taxes later on things like national insurance contributions.
So unprecedented stimulus packages are becoming a weekly occurrence now, sometimes even bi-weekly, but we haven't heard a lot of talk about the future in recent days and weeks. Understandably so, we're living in a crisis in the present, but today was the first time since his original budget that the Chancellor, Rishi Sunak, started talking about the future, and he did imply that given this unprecedented handout to the self-employed, which is obviously the right thing to do as many people's incomes will be diminishing right now, we're going to have to look at their pay and their tax benefits that they get down the road, especially, well, he didn't say this, but likely around national insurance, something that former Chancellor Philip Hammond tried to change and then was forced to do a U-turn on because it was thought not to fit in the Tory manifesto. And while the Chancellor didn't say much on that today, I think we're starting to see slight hints and undertones about the serious financial burden that we're taking on through these coronavirus stimulus packages, and lots of us, all of us, are going to have to be a part of paying that back down the road. So he started with the self-employed today, but it won't just be that group. That's eventually going to extend to us all, I would suspect.
And, you know, just, Sonia, looking at the front of the FT, and these figures now, I mean, so gigantic. I mean, Sunak unveils £3 billion a month rescue deal for self-employed. I mean, they've lost their ability to shock.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I mean, it's the right thing to do. That's the key thing, because these times are so unprecedented. It's such an unprecedented level of economic shock. And what the Chancellor has to think about, and I think it's really, you know, it says it all really, that a Conservative Chancellor is taking these measures. I think a Labour government would be doing exactly the same thing. But this really isn't a party political point. I think politicians on all sides of the spectrum, projecting forwards, they can see that with businesses having to shut across the country for health reasons, it's absolutely right that they should do. And with people having to work from home, and lots of people can't do their jobs from home, lots of those businesses are not going to exist in 3 months' time. Loads of those jobs won't exist in 3 months' time unless the Treasury steps in and becomes the guarantor of last resort.
Yeah, unless the Treasury steps in. But ultimately, let's not forget, I suppose some people will say, with taxpayers' money, Kate, and we're on the hook.
Well, in terms of the employee benefits, that's true, but such a large chunk of the stimulus so far, those business loans, don't necessarily fall on the taxpayer. The idea is that if you are a viable business and you can get through this hibernation where you don't have customers and you aren't making a profit because government guidance is that your customers need to stay inside and not come shop with you and not come eat with you, if you can get through this period, then you're going to pay that loan back. So it doesn't all fall on the taxpayer. But no doubt we are looking at unprecedented amounts of spending. There are already forecasts suggesting that this is going to go far past what was used to deal with the financial crisis in 2008. And, you know, there's going to be real repercussions that we're going to have to deal with when we come out of this on the other side.
Sonia, let's just leave the Chancellor's announcement to one side and turn to something that falls into the Home Secretary's basket. Checkpoint Britain says Metro. But actually, it's a reminder, isn't it, that different police forces, 43, is it 40, 41, 43, in England, have different approaches to this. So we saw the pictures from North Yorkshire. They were using drones in Derbyshire. Checkpoint Britain.
Yes, that's right. And this story is really about some police forces are increasingly doing checks. They're stopping drivers. They're checking why people are out, what the purpose of their journey is. It is something that government warned us would happen. I think it's right, but we don't want it to set a long-term trend for us. And I think that although we will see some of this, what police forces up and down the country have been really clear about is we cannot rely on the police to enforce the rules that the government have asked us to abide by in terms of staying at home. And that's both because of resources. So the police force is incredibly stretched after the cuts of the last 10 years, but also in this country, we have a culture of doing policing by consent. So we don't really have a police force that is used to being out in the community, stopping people that they don't think are doing anything wrong and saying, hey, hang on a second, what are you doing here? Like in some countries they do. So I think we will see more of a police presence, but at the same time, in the main, it is going to come down to all of us to do what the government's asked us to do and to stay at home to save lives.
Kate, when do you think, if at all, civil libertarians will start getting nervous about this sort of thing?
Well, I think a lot of them already are, but recognize that, these are very, very unique times, and hopefully this only has to last for a very short period of time. But we've seen the Prime Minister, who I think socially is quite libertarian by nature, very uncomfortable about these measures having to come into effect. That actually gives me reassurance that our politicians are really thinking through the fact that civil liberties are at risk in moments like this and doing everything they can to make sure that as soon as those rights come back, we have them in our grasp. And, we just have to use sensibility right now and thoughtfulness when it comes to these situations. The police are able to increase fines if they think you're going out without good reason. There is even talk of arrest, but you'd have to hope that everybody's being sensible in these situations, listening, understanding, being thoughtful around this, and not taking it too far. We have seen some pushback today and criticism of the use of drones in the Peak District, where you actually had footage of people potentially traveling unnecessarily, but also really social distancing and completely alone out there. So we just have to use good sense about this, both the police force and those on the road and those walking around, because of course the police are really burdened right now. And this is a test of all of us in these moments, and we have to rise to it.
Just time for a couple of tabloid stories. The Daily Mirror, clap for your NHS, Sonia.
Yeah, well, I think like lots of Brits, I ventured outside at 8 o'clock today to clap for our carers, clap for NHS staff, care workers, people, hospital porters, everyone who's involved in keeping our NHS and care services going in these tough times. I sort of ventured out, wasn't sure if it would just be me standing there clapping my hands, but it was amazing. There were people out where I live whooping, cheering for health workers. You could hear it all around where I lived. And it was a really, really amazing moment, a really stirring moment, I thought. And I hope it goes some way to show our health workers, our care workers, how grateful we are for the work they're doing in these incredibly challenging times. And some of them are making huge sacrifices. We have doctors and nurses and hospital workers who are isolating themselves from their own family. They've sent their children away to live with family because they don't want to put their own family at risk. And I think that just shows the level of sacrifice they're making.
And just away from coronavirus, we will get to talk about this in the next hour, Kate, I'm sure. But let's just show you the front page of The Sun. It's on its way. And the story there, exclusive, I'm sure they're saying, yes, they are, that Harry and Meghan are moving, as some had speculated they would do, from Canada to California. So that's something we'll digest a little more fully in the next hour. In the meantime, let's bring you the weather.